Succession Planning Framework and Management.
I'm Jennifer Harrington. I'm currently an attorney who practices at a law firm up in Algona, Iowa, the Buchanan, Bibler, Gabor, and Mice law firm.
Succession planning versus estate planning.
I think a lot of the times when I see producers or people with operations in and we talk about estate planning, that is really where estate planning and succession planning really meet the road. Estate planning really is planning for your demise, right? For when you are no longer here and you need to transfer your assets to the next generation. And what I like to remind people is that your estate plan will affect management decisions, right? Who you put in charge of your estate. So if you have a trust, that's a trustee. If you have a will, that's an executor. If you don't have anything, that person's called, long story short, they're called a personal representative in the eyes of the court. In that point of view, that person's going to be making the management decisions. So they're going to be deciding who gets hired to actually take care of the cattle. They're going to be deciding when things get sold. And that's kind of the default. So unless we do some additional planning, we can need to kind of make sure that that person is equipped to make those management decisions. But then ultimately, an estate plan really deals with the equity of the operation, right? An estate plan, when you're talking about I give to, what you're giving to them is the financial benefit of it. You're not always necessarily giving them the management of that asset, but obviously, when you give somebody the financial benefit of something, they tend to come with rights from a legal point of view, and those rights obviously influence how that asset can be managed. And so estate planning influences your succession plan, but it really is not your succession plan. I think a lot of the times when we talk about succession plan in this industry and in a lot of in agriculture as a whole, what they're really talking about is, are you prepared from a management point of view to deal with you being unable to make the daily decisions? And what is the plan in that sense to make sure, hay gets bought when it needs to be, or that the vet is called at an appropriate time, or even more importantly, probably that the vet is paid at an appropriate time, right? So how are we making sure that we can continue this operation so that the person who's going to receive both probably who you intend to get both probably the management and possibly the financial benefit from, that they have an operation that isn't hair on fire when they receive it, right? And so that's where the estate plan influences, but is not the succession plan. And I think that's where you want to make sure, ultimately, that you have a team around you that understands who's going to be doing what, in a variety of situations.
Fairness in the process.
When people come in for estate planning, even if you've known the lawyer in the community and they grew up with your kids and their kids were, with you, or, ultimately your lawyer doesn't know your family dynamics. So, what I am saying, and I guess in general, take with a grain of salt. But I think that a lot of things kind of trickle down to fair isn't always equal, right? Or equal isn't always fair. And anybody who's in the agricultural world, I think has heard various concepts of it, but I think what really comes into mind is, when we see the fund terms at the end of the will, or in kind of what we say, in the dispositive and in the distribution provisions, when it says share and share alike, that's exactly kind of what you've set up, is that you've created this situation where they truly are sharing an asset. They are sharing the operation. And so while that on paper sounds really great and that creates an equality, that doesn't necessarily mean that the on-farm heir gets to make all the management decisions, right? Even though probably they've been set up, that's probably the way we've thought about how it will work. But that's not always how it shakes out. And so I think there's kind of this idea of, back to this concept of, from a management perspective, what is fair, right? It's not always what is fair from an equitable, right? From the equity perspective, right? The value of your farm parsed out equally, is that truly fair? And even if that is fair, is that going to be the best thing for the operation? And those are questions that each family really does have to wrestle with. I know when I do client meetings, I do like to push and say, push come to shove, what's more important? Everybody kind of getting financially around the same amount, or that on-farm heir is kind of able to continue to grow and doesn't really need to buy out the family asset again? What is your priority there? Usually people don't like making that decision. So I know that that's a hard one, but I think, knowing deep down in your pit what you think is right, if you had to rank them, if you had to make that choice, is really going to help create the safety net that is your succession plan, right? Because that's what a succession plan is. A written succession plan worked with an attorney is what happens when some bickering, some infighting happens, some tension happens, usually when you're gone, and we need to have a set of rules so that we can create a resolution and continue an operation, right? Continue to be a farming family in some way.
Retirement planning.
Oh, retirement planning. One, be realistic. I mean, both from both an equity point of view, from a financial point of view, what do you need? What income do you need from the farm? That said, I think those numbers are something we can kind of work with and get towards. It tends to be a 3 to 5 year process. But financially, from an equity point of view, usually we can find a way to make the numbers work. Truly, from a management point of view, I think that's the trickier one. And unfortunately, that's the one where, your lawyers, your accountants, that's not the schooling that we brought to the table, right? We can write a lot of agreements, that say you're going to, be done making this decision by this date or things of that nature. And I do think that there's value in writing it down and communicating it and making sure that the next generation knows the plan and also that the plan. But ultimately, creating an enforceable iron grid retirement contract for the next generation to kind of take up can sometimes be really difficult. And that's true for both on-farm and, I should say, related and unrelated next generation.
Using business entities to achieve management outcomes.
Business entities are a way to make decisions, right? They create a framework, right? If you're a corporation, right, you have a board of directors, you have shareholders, right? People who own shares in the corp. They vote in your board of directors. Your board of directors creates your officers. Now, in closely held businesses, you probably might have 1 or 2 people that are all 3 of those, but that's how that works. When you pass away, then, your shares go to somebody and they get to vote in kind of new management, if you will. And that's typically how an estate plan works. For the most part, if you are a succession plan, estate plan, business entity kind of where they merge, that's how that works. Is for the most part, your beneficiaries under your estate plan will receive the financial benefit of the entity, but they probably don't have management rights in that entity. So an entity, again, when I'm talking about an entity, that is like an LLC, right? A limited liability company. A partnership, right? So sometimes we hear them kind of like LLPs, when that's a limited liability partnership, which is allowed under Iowa law, or like a corp, right? So like a corporation. And now there's different taxations, but right now I'm just kind of talking in that legal realm. So from a legal point of view, a lot of the times, your beneficiaries under your estate plan will receive the financial benefit of the entity, but the management of the entity, like the entity itself, right, the LLC or the corporation, their rules will dictate how that beneficiary will get to have management power. And usually it requires, basically a vote of the members or a vote of the other people involved in the entity saying, hey, yeah, I want this person to actually have management rights and be able to vote and do all of these things. So that's kind of how that influences an estate plan. So I would say where people get in trouble is where they do the cookie cutter, right? Where they have somebody who doesn't specialize in this area, and so they just have this general estate plan and LLC and nothing specialized for the operation. And so then we create this situation where maybe now there are 3 equal owners of this operation, right? Of this entity, right? Now I have one who actually knows how the entity works, but we have 2 who are equal owners who now really can outvote that one who's actually been trained on how to actually run the operation and say, actually, you know what? That might have been how we do it in the past, but I think we're going to apply for this 10% interest loan, and we're going to just expand, and we're going to get into rabbits or whatever, right? And at that point, like, the on-farm might say, hey, we don't have the manpower for this. This is a stupid idea. I don't even want to become a rabbit farmer. What are we doing? And if the third person says, hey, actually rabbits sound like a great idea right now, that's going to become a rabbit operation, right? Like that's how the default management works is kind of like majority vote. And so that's where we want to get into a place where if you have an entity and there are a lot of good legal and liability reasons on why your operation should be in an entity, ultimately, I think sometimes the estate or the succession planning consequences of kind of a default entity don't get explained to people. And that's where we end up with kind of these situations where we kind of have off-farm heirs kind of with management authority or the ability to kind of create some weird management authority. And ultimately, this is a little bit of a segue kind of into the estate planning, but when a matriarch and patriarch pass away, and ultimately a lot of the times kids revert back into like their sibling dynamics among themselves, especially for that first year or 2. And I say this as somebody who has 3 younger brothers, right? I'm the oldest daughter, the only daughter. There were 4 of us. And I know, and I see in my practice, and I know when we will go through it, there will be moments and things said that will just revert back to when I was 8 and he was 4. One of my brothers was 4. And there will be hurt feelings because of the way something was said. And that, I think that's an inevitable. And so we just kind of have to plan knowing that grief is funny. And very rarely does grief create a kumbaya moment where everybody is just ready to tackle this new problem. Because grief is hard and it hurts.